How the turns have tabled. NVIDIA is now playing the role of AMD circa Vega, which is not good. The drivers have been unstable, and we've been able to replicate that. In one game, we had system crashes after enabling NVIDIA's frame generation, which is unfortunate since it marketed the 50 series on the back of MFG and fake frames.
RTX 5070, 4090 performance at 5.
We had reboots loading into Cyberpunk, crashes and driver errors in Tomb Raider, and issues with screen distortion and artifacting. But these issues didn't show up in our 50 series reviews, which is our first hint that newer driver versions are more problematic than those that came out a couple months ago. Game developers have recently begun recommending rolling back to older NVIDIA drivers. Inzoi, the studio that NVIDIA has heavily promoted for partnership with its AI features, threw NVIDIA under the bus, stating, quote, "Using driver versions 572.xx or later may result in occasional frame drops or stuttering. If issues persist, we recommend installing version 566.36, which is actually from December." Developer Neopal stated, quote, "Using driver versions 572.xx or later may result in occasional frame drops or stuttering," end quote. This aligns with our findings for the past week, where we've been trying to replicate these issues that have been widely reported online. There's hundreds of comments across multiple mega threads on Reddit, and we were able to replicate it. But one of the interesting things we found was that the monitor order, as in the display out order of the monitor 1 and monitor 2 in Windows via the actual hardware connection to the video card, that seems to matter here. We're going to show that today. But users report a lot of problems. Commonly, they note various display issues like black screens, flickering, and sometimes even unprompted system reboots and hard crashes. This includes other types of crashes too, like crash to desktop. Upon a closer inspection, it wasn't only 50 series users dealing with the issues. Many users of NVIDIA's previous generations of GPUs, particularly the 40 and 30 series, are also affected by the recent drivers. Several users speculated on the impact of multiple monitors, the impact of mixed or higher refresh rates, and even how NVIDIA's own GSync might be affecting the driver stability. There's been at least one mega thread on Reddit with hundreds of reports, and these issues have been in the news since the launch of the 50 series. This also applies to cards from multiple generations, so this is at least the 30 through the 50 series that we know of right now, and we've been able to replicate these and have isolated some of the causes. We have a few stopgap solutions for you. They're not great because they are stopgaps, so you're turning stuff off that you might want on, especially if it's causing problems and you turned it on to begin with, but now you have to turn it off to fix the problems. But it may help for the time being, and so we'll go through that today as well. Before that, this video is brought to you by ID Cooling and the Frozen A720 cooler. The A720 air cooler performed well in our testing last year. The A720 is a relatively high-end, dual 140mm air cooler with 7 heat pipes. We found the use of larger fans can be beneficial to acoustic performance given the thermals, although you'll want to check your case for compatibility given the taller nature of the cooler and its fans. ID Cooling uses an all-black look for its A720 and includes mounting hardware for all modern sockets. Learn more at the link in the description below. First up, user reports largely point to driver version 566.36 as what the users think is the most stable version of NVIDIA's driver set. This version was released on December 5th, 2024, just prior to the 50 series launch in January. In the 4 months since that driver's release, NVIDIA has posted 6 GeForce game-ready drivers and at least 4 hotfix drivers that are still public, specifically aimed at fixing bugs and system crashes. So there's definitely a problem, but in order to test for it, it's kind of difficult because it's sometimes spontaneous, and it also requires a mixture of hardware and software that we clearly didn't have, or at least when factoring the drivers as well, for the initial reviews because the issues didn't occur then. And so since they started happening after the reviews in January, that narrows our scope a little bit to look at driver versions later, but also we can look at what's different with user reports online from our typical test setup. And we found quite a few things that are useful for this because obviously there's literally millions of combinations of hardware, though not if Apple has its way, but there's millions of combinations of hardware, which makes this type of troubleshooting hard. So before we began, we went through an assortment of user reports to find games, system configurations, and specific settings that seemed especially problematic to get a starting point for our testing. That's the other challenge too. Between millions of combinations of hardware components, monitors, peripherals, and then the game settings, it's probably more like billions or in the very least hundreds of millions of combinations. But this was all made easier because NVIDIA's buzzwords were the root cause of at least a few of them. So that limits it to just a couple of options to toggle on and off, which was far easier to work with. For our test bench setup, we used a modified version of our standard test bench. We bought a couple of games that people had particular issues with, and our standard GPU review bench was combined with a couple of these changes. So first of all, we had the 9800X3D. We used an RTX 4070 Super for testing. We used dual monitors this time. So we had an Acer 4K 60Hz display, not G-Sync compatible, and we had a Dell or Alienware 1080p 360Hz monitor that is G-Sync compatible, but we ran it at 240 Hz. Both were connected via DisplayPort, and this part is important. In Windows, we manually set the monitor order sometimes. So we had monitor 1 as the Acer 4K display and monitor 2 as the Alienware monitor, which was checked as the main display in Windows settings. This monitor is capable of 360 Hz, but it's been lowered again to 240 for our testing today. For the board, we used our standard Asus ROG X670E Hero. We had the RAM at standard settings for our GPU review bench, and the power supply remains the EVGA 1600T2. Driver version for the initial testing was 572.83, which was the most recent when we began this testing, and that was released on March 18th. So we have a very intentional mix of different resolution displays, different G-Sync compatibility, different refresh rates, and then of course we're going to change the drivers as we go through this. That's kind of the main variable here. But the displays are the key ones to pay attention to for where we initially replicate issues. Now that's not the only place there's problems with NVIDIA's drivers. They have a lot of them right now. They're really trying their best to be like the Intel Alchemist launch. So it's actually probably one of the most insulting things that could be said about drivers. Intel's done a lot to fix it. But Alchemist, the launch was not good. So that's the direction NVIDIA is going on its current trajectory. But our first goal was to simply identify a game crashing. And so from there, we would be able to walk through what we did leading up to the failure and then start isolating the individual changes we made one at a time and just modify one variable each step of the way to try and isolate the issue. Once we could consistently reproduce the complication, we would then mostly focus our efforts on toggling G-Sync, frame generation, DLSS. These are all bad things for NVIDIA to be the root cause because they are NVIDIA's marketing points. And then we also moved to a single monitor. We swapped the ports for the monitor on the GPU side. So we just moved from 1 to 2 basically, and did that for each game issue that we experienced. It took a while. Here's what we found. In our testing on NVIDIA's most recent driver, at the time of testing that is, 572.83 when we started, we found 4 different instances of game crashes that could be consistently reproduced. In Star Wars Outlaws, we experienced failures after selecting Resume in the startup menu. In Marvel Rivals, we'd observe system reboots either directly after applying frame generation in the pre-menu settings or after applying the settings and then exiting to desktop from a match. In Cyberpunk 2077, we encountered reboots when loading into the game. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, when running the in-game benchmark, we faced a game crash along with a driver error. After rolling back to a previous driver, we could no longer replicate any of these same failures on any of these games. And that's the reason this took a week or two to really kind of put together, because we were trying to isolate for, is this a problem with the game or a problem with something relating to NVIDIA? Or NVIDIA's settings in that game. Our initial findings led us to believe that the driver issues are likely most affecting users with specific hardware combinations for display and graphics settings. Specifically, those using 2 monitors with G-Sync and with FrameGen enabled. We also found something really interesting regarding the physical output ports of the GPU itself and how the monitors are identified in Windows display settings. Now that part we don't understand fully what sort of happens within the driver and in the Windows level when you're changing these settings of which monitor is identified as monitor 1 versus 2, or which is in port 1 or port 2, but we don't really need to understand how it works. It'd be nice to. And if you happen to know, you're a driver developer or something, you can let us know below. What really matters though is that we're able to replicate the problem and fix it with a workaround, which that we could do. We'll go over that in a minute though. We have some more findings to go over first. DLSS and reflex may also factor into the equation, but unfortunately we weren't able to make a clear determination. In some games, DLSS or reflex will be automatically enabled when using FrameGen, meaning that we were not always able to fully isolate each of these variables because one will force the other. Additionally, sometimes lowering the refresh rate to 120 Hz on our second monitor would resolve issues, while other times it didn't. Something that especially stood out to us was that we could only replicate 3 of the 4 failures when both monitors were connected via DisplayPort and when monitor 2 was checked as the main display in Windows settings. As seen here, when our Acer monitor was plugged into what we're calling slot 3, and our Alienware monitor was plugged into what we're calling slot 2, which is just based on sort of your perspective, we didn't have any issues. But when we swapped the slots the monitors were plugged into, effectively converting monitor 1 to monitor 2 within Windows detection and vice versa, and then made monitor 2 the main display, we saw crashes again consistently. And I want to give Tannen on the team specific commendation for realizing that pattern, because that's kind of a weird thing to find. It's really not a typical failure mode that we would run into. So some good work digging that up. Now, this has less to do with physical ports and being used, and more to do with how they're being detected within Windows and the physical ports and how all that interacts with the drivers. So we couldn't tell you why specifically the behavior of monitor 1 or 2 triggers the issue, but what we know is that it does. And swapping monitors 1 and 2 for you could potentially help here. So if you're having these problems, one of the easiest things you can do is literally just change the plugs. And then follow the steps we just laid out within Windows as well to check for 1, 2, and main display. Now, we actually found this by accident because the day after we recorded our first game crashes, which I think happened in Cyberpunk, the next time we came back to try and recreate that particular failure, it didn't happen again. And so we ended up stuck in the situation of, is it just Cyberpunk? Cyberpunk's got a lot of issues. It could definitely just be Cyberpunk. But when trying to troubleshoot what, if anything, had changed, we found that in between the first testing and the second round of testing, we had changed the ports that the monitors were plugged into, and that was the only difference. It was the DP output slots on the GPU. After switching them back to the original position, 100% of the time, we were able to recreate the problem and observe the failure again. And to our surprise, this same circumstance has appeared in multiple games. As for similarities between the issues in Star Wars Outlaws, Marvel Rivals, and Cyberpunk 2077, all games that natively support DLSS 4, we were unable to produce a failure when either GSync or FrameGen were disabled. We also separately couldn't trigger a crash after swapping output slots or on a single monitor setup. So DLSS 4 and FrameGen are also problems here. It's not just the monitor order or the monitor ports. Now, the error in Shadow of the Tomb Raider was different from what we're discussing. So first of all, GSync did not seem to affect Shadow of the Tomb Raider, whether it was on or off. Secondly, it doesn't have FrameGen, or at least the version we were testing doesn't. Additionally, it experienced the same failures on a single monitor and on multiple output ports. So none of the other issues we've talked about thus far were the cause for Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Instead, we were able to boil this problem down to having RTX shadow quality set to ultra in the in-game settings. And we know for a fact that this didn't always cause a crash because I personally was running the tests on it with RTX shadow quality set to ultra in prior versions of our benchmark suite with different drivers. Now, in regards to the commonalities between all of these, to kind of boil it down to the simplest elements, these 4 games share a couple things in common. First of all, with NVIDIA's most recent drivers at the time of testing, which again was March 18th, so it's a little bit back, that's where the crashes happened. We were not able to repro these issues on NVIDIA's 566.36 December 5th driver, and because we were testing with the 4070, that driver works on the 4070. It predates the 50 series though, so you would have a problem there. So that's number 1, rolling back helped. Rolling back to driver version 566.36 though doesn't guarantee that crashing will stop. There, from what we've read online, are definitely still issues with that driver. It just kind of depends, I think, on the configuration of the games, the settings, and the hardware you have. But we were unable to prompt the same failures that we've been discussing and that we were previously able to recreate from user reports. This, along with various user reports, seems to suggest that driver version 566.36 is the current most stable NVIDIA driver that's out. And unfortunately, if you're on the 50 series, that's not going to help you. There are a lot of other issues reported online, but that's what we've replicated so far. Many users, for example, saw problems in games that didn't occur until after multiple hours of gameplay. And as much as we'd like to, we can't spend several hours playing random games to see if it might crash. It's just too unpredictable. On the same note, just because we weren't able to repeat our failure when we turned GSync or FrameGen off, doesn't mean that turning these options off will solve all problems, but it hopefully will help some of you. There were some other issues we commonly saw in our research. One of them has to do with sleep. Not the usual issues with sleep. with the benchmarking and the reviews that I have. But Windows sleep, a different really common problem. So S3 in Windows, the sleep state, there were reports online with people having issues with the computer waking from sleep and resuming from idle states. And we were able to recreate at least one of these by accident because Patrick on the team with his home system, his personal system, noticed that there have been issues waking the system from sleep when the PC's been idle. And on wake, the monitors will appear to turn on, but they don't receive any signal, and the screens remain black. And so then he had to hard shut down, hold the power button, reboot it, and then it worked again. Windows has its own decades of issues with sleep in S3, so that particular one, it's hard to know who specifically is at fault, if it's NVIDIA with the drivers or if it's Microsoft with Windows. Another issue we've seen going around has to do with Alt-Tab acting buggy. This is kind of a weird one too. We saw some reports of people saying it freezes games when switching windows while playing a game. Now, we did occasionally encounter this bug, but it wasn't something we could recreate every time consistently, and it also seems to be fixed by Alt-Tabbing again or switching windows when playing a game. And again, this one is difficult to pinpoint between NVIDIA versus Microsoft. NVIDIA has had several drivers with driver notes addressing parts of this, despite the driver not fixing everything. In NVIDIA's 572.83 driver release notes, one open issue states, quote, Cyberpunk 2077 Half-Life 2 RTX. PC may bug check with error 0xD1 when playing game while using DLSS FrameGen and GSync. And then they've got a code for it. Now, we're glad to see that issues relating to FrameGen and GSync are being acknowledged, but we'd like to see more from NVIDIA here. This is a relatively vague description, and it only mentions 2 games that are being affected by this much larger issue. NVIDIA has also had multiple hot fixes. We've reported on some of them where it says it's trying to fix issues with originally the 50 series and then just basically everything. Now, we've known for a while now that NVIDIA has shifted its focus away from the gaming enthusiast market, the little guy as it were, and towards, what was it again?
AI.
Okay, enough of that. We already did that. We have 10 minutes and 12 seconds of that from April 1st. No, it was not a joke. We don't need to see more of that montage right now. So we've known they've kind of abandoned the gaming market. They're still making stuff for it, but the focus is elsewhere. That's fine. But what they can't really do, at least not without some kind of consequence, of course, they could do whatever they want. We'll see what happens, but what they really shouldn't be doing is regressing, and that's what's happening right now. So they are losing ground in an area where they, NVIDIA, have had such refinement that for the longest time, it was you buy NVIDIA and you pay extra for it. This was back during AMD minus $50 because it has better drivers. That was kind of the whole thing. It's like, I reviewed GPUs from AMD where you install the driver and the screen turns into a 4x3, like literal 4-inch by 3-inch on the monitor. It was difficult to get it back, or it'd blink red, or it would crash all the time in games, or whatever. That was AMD's biggest problem for the longest time. The reviews were, the value seems okay if you can deal with the drivers sometimes just randomly being complete shit. But that's where NVIDIA is going right now. So NVIDIA has been known for its driver stability, and that's why it's so important to have a dedicated video talking about driver instability, because AMD got like a dozen of these from us back when it couldn't fix its damn drivers. And weirdly enough, AMD's drivers right now are relatively stable, at least as far as we've seen from the current versions. As for NVIDIA, the driver issues they have are another mark upon NVIDIA's tarnished gaming consumer reputation with the 50 series launch as the company shifts focus. But losing prior gained ground shouldn't be in the cards for them, and NVIDIA hopefully will recognize that these issues are damaging to its long-term brand credibility. We'll give some recommendations here for those of you who are having issues, just in case it helps. These are things that resolve the issues as a workaround for our setup. The real resolution would be an NVIDIA driver update. But in the meantime, we've got some things that might help you. You could try troubleshooting, and if your solution's not in this list, feel free to leave it below, and it might help other people. Remember, this is an issue where, again, once you factor in the game settings as well, there are probably literally billions of combinations of things. It does get easier when you look at just NVIDIA's, but it's still, I mean, it's a lot, and that's why this has been tough for people to pinpoint. So leave your suggestions below if you've got a fix that's not in our list. So first of all, we'd recommend swapping the order of your display outputs on the GPU itself, only because it is one of the easiest possible things you can do. It's really quick. We don't fully understand how effective this fix is yet at large, and that's what you all would be helpful for with posting your experiences. But it's simple and it works for us. Now, we'd also suggest swapping cables to HDMI. It's not ideal, but just to troubleshoot and see if anything changes if you have one lying around. If you don't feel strongly about GSync or frame generation being enabled, we would also suggest disabling those settings. Even if you do want it enabled, you should still toggle it off and just see what happens, because if you're able to resolve the issue that way, that's a quick, simple stopgap until NVIDIA gets its shit together. Considering NVIDIA's whole marketing gimmick lately has been frame generation, this is a bad solution for NVIDIA, but it is hopefully a stopgap. And again, that one worked for us as well. Now, the next one we have, the last suggestion we have really is a rollback to a previous driver version, and we have some notes on how to do this properly. So there's really a much better way to do it than just double clicking the exe. We're gonna walk you through that really quickly. But if you're able to recall a specific driver you previously used that didn't cause these issues, easiest thing to do is go back to that. If not, then try 566.36, at least if you're on the pre-50 series, because that seems to be the most stable by community posting right now and by our own testing. So as general process control, the best way to do a clean install of drivers and get rid of driver so-called gremlins that might get left behind, stuff that gets stuck in the registry or in Windows files, directories. The way to do this is first go to NVIDIA's site and download the driver you want, so 566.36 or whatever was stable for you previously. Then download DDU, Display Driver Uninstaller, which is from Wagner Soft, and get the latest version and watch out for the minefield of ads that say download on the page, but grab DDU. Then what you should do after you install DDU is disconnect your internet. So if it's wireless, just toggle it off for a minute. If it's Ethernet, unplug it. The reason for this is to prevent Windows from attempting to install a driver for the NVIDIA device before you can manually install the one you want. This is important. This is something that we do for all GPU reviews because it ensures that we are in full control as the user and we're not giving Windows any control through the internet. So disconnect internet. Reboot into safe mode with DDU. So they've got an uninstall with safe mode option. You can find it in the options menu and enable it. So you reboot into safe mode, do a clean uninstall and reboot of the NVIDIA driver. That'll put you back into Windows, still disconnected from the internet. Run the installer for the driver version you want. And then for NVIDIA, select custom and select perform clean install. Go through that process. And that should be about as close as you can reasonably get as an end user for a clean install of the drivers and wiping out the old stuff. We'd recommend just save these steps for the future too, in case you need them. But that's the way we would do it. Now, a couple things we noticed online. And you should maybe pause Windows updates while you're doing all this too. But a couple things we noticed. So we haven't experienced this, but we've seen some users say that with NV app, the new NVIDIA app, this would lead to certain issues where reinstalling the same driver that NV app claims to install, but doing so manually, would sometimes fix people's issues. So if you're using NV app, you can maybe do all this stuff without NV app and see if that fixes it for you. Unfortunately, all these suggestions we have, while they will help in a lot of cases, they're just workarounds. They don't fix the problem. So we just have to wait for NVIDIA to provide a legitimate solution and get it together. But this has been an absolutely abhorrent and completely embarrassing launch for NVIDIA. I mean, we talked about it already a couple times. Genuinely, I've been doing this since 2008, been focusing on hardware since about 2010. In the time since then, this is the worst launch I've ever seen for NVIDIA. And it very well may be the worst GPU launch I've covered for a series. It is for a series. And that's saying a lot, because AMD had some impressively bad, like award-winningly bad drivers for years there. You go back to Fiji and Vega and all that stuff. It was a disaster for AMD. NVIDIA has taken that over. Intel Arc with Alchemist, at least our expectations were they probably would have problems, and they did, and they mostly fixed them, at least as far as a newer of the three companies would be concerned. But NVIDIA here it continues to fumble in impressively bad ways, and realistically, this should, you would think, reflect on their economic performance for at least the consumer market, which maybe they don't care that much about. Fine, but this is the type of thing that loses market share. And it's up to AMD and Intel, as we said previously, to capitalize on that, because it's not your job as a consumer to buy the other one to kickstart their ambitions of being a better number 2 player. But at the same time, it is NVIDIA's job to keep the customers too. So, and they are failing in that aspect. So then it's really just up to you of whether, if you're like, I could deal with it, I really need NVIDIA for CUDA, or I've always used NVIDIA and it's been mostly good for me, then fine, whatever. But stuff to think about. So that's it for this one. We'll cover it in hardware news when NVIDIA posts an update that actually fixes stuff. We'll go back through and retest the games that we've tested here and just confirm it's resolved, at least for those issues. And then obviously it helps us to see your comments with issues you're having with this hardware, because as I keep saying, there's so many combinations that we really rely on the user reports to narrow down our scope of what to test for, to try and isolate and help everybody. So you can head over to the store on store.gamersnexus.net to grab something like our 3D PC-themed coaster packs, which include a red and black motherboard coaster. We've got fans, SSDs, RAM coasters, all that stuff. We also have our project and soldering mats, which are made of a high heat-resistant silicone, and our mod mats, which have pinout diagrams, screw tracking grids, rulers, SSD, RAM sticks to scale for the pin location, and even these cool diagrams of a Zen 4 die location, for example, to show you how a CPU, at least on AMD, is constructed under the IHS. And we've been selling those mod mats since about 2017 or so, I think now. It's crazy. It's been my favorite thing to make, although the soldering mats have they're in close competition. The soldering mats I really love working on. So anyway, if you want to directly support what we do, then you can go to the store to grab some of those items. It directly funds the weeks of research we do on these topics and all the benchmarking. Additionally, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus if you want to simply throw a few bucks our way every month. And that'll be it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.